The snow's silent witness. The snowstorm had grown fierce by the time Marcus Chen maneuvered his sleek black Toyota Camry through the icy streets of Baltimore. Each flake, a frozen shard, seemed to mirror his own exhaustion after a marathon city council budget meeting that had stretched well beyond its scheduled time. His mind ached from hours of contentious debates, figures thrown around like weapons, and the lingering frustration of knowing that many of his proposals would face further delays. The city's bureaucracy was a labyrinth, and tonight it felt particularly stifling. The dashboard clock blinked a weary 11:47 p.m., and the thought of home was his singular comfort. His wife, Sarah, would undoubtedly have left dinner waiting, carefully wrapped to keep it warm. The anticipation of her comforting smile and the promise of their modest home beckoned him like a beacon. Yet fate had different plans. As Marcus approached a dimly lit intersection, the distant hum of the city seemed to quiet, overtaken by the rhythm of the storm. Then, a flash of red and blue lights burst into his rearview mirror, sharp and jarring against the soft, swirling snow. The wail of the siren followed, slicing through his daydreams with cruel precision. Confusion flickered across Marcus's face. He wasn't speeding, and his car, freshly serviced, was in perfect order. A lifetime of habit prompted him to slow down and pull over beneath a streetlight whose bulb flickered erratically, casting sporadic shadows across the empty street. The storm muffled the world around him, creating an eerie isolation. As Marcus came to a stop, his father's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from his teenage years when they'd practiced how to handle traffic stops. "Stay calm, son. Be polite. Don't give them a reason to escalate." Two officers emerged from the patrol car. Their figures loomed large, silhouettes dark against the pale snow. One, burly and broad-shouldered, moved with an air of command. His nameplate, gleaming faintly in the dim light, read Brady. His partner, younger and wiry, with nervous energy radiating off him, hung back, his hand resting near his holster. His badge read Thompson. Brady approached first, tapping sharply on the glass before Marcus could fully lower the window. The harsh sound, coupled with the freezing wind seeping into the car, sent a shiver through him. "License and registration," Brady barked, his tone clipped and demanding, devoid of courtesy or explanation. Marcus, suppressing the irritation bubbling within, reached slowly for his documents. Years of navigating tense negotiations had taught him that maintaining composure, even in the face of blatant hostility, was a strength. "May I ask why I've been pulled over, officer?" Marcus inquired evenly, his voice measured but firm. Brady smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "Your taillight's out." Marcus frowned, glancing in his rearview mirror instinctively. "Are you certain? I just had the car serviced." "I said it's out," Brady interrupted sharply, his tone hardening. His chest puffed as though issuing a challenge. A gnawing unease crept through Marcus. He sensed that the taillight excuse was a pretext. Before he could respond further, Brady stepped back, gesturing with a sharp nod. "Step out of the vehicle." The demand caught Marcus off guard. Snow swirled around the car, the wind picking up with a howl that seemed almost sentient. He hesitated, but only for a fraction of a second. His father's advice rang out again. "Don't argue. Follow instructions." Marcus opened the door and stepped out, the icy pavement slippery beneath his leather shoes. The cold hit him like a wall, the chill seeping through his tailored suit. He wrapped his arms around himself instinctively, his breath puffing invisible clouds. Brady circled him slowly, his boots crunching in the fresh snow, each step deliberate, calculated. Marcus stood still, his posture straight but not confrontational. He noticed Thompson's flashlight beam sweeping through the interior of his car, lingering on his laptop in the back seat and the leather seats. The younger officer smirked, clearly enjoying his role in the spectacle. "Nice ride," Thompson commented, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Must be nice to have councilman money." Brady stopped in front of Marcus, his sneer deepening. "So, You're one of those, huh? Think you're above the law just because you wear a fancy suit. Marcus exhaled slowly, choosing his words carefully. I respect the law, officer. I'd simply appreciate clarity on why. Clarification. Brady cut him off, stepping closer until he was nearly chest to chest with Marcus. Out here, I'm the law, and you're just another citizen who needs to learn some respect. The words hung heavy in the frigid air, underlined by Brady's mocking grin. Marcus could feel the heat of anger rising, his fists clenching instinctively. But he didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he looked past Brady toward the windows of nearby apartment buildings. Curtains fluttered. Dimly lit silhouettes peered out cautiously, their foams glowing faintly in the dark. A strange sense of relief washed over Marcus. People were watching. Brady, seemingly undeterred by the presence of potential witnesses, took a step back. "You're looking cold, Councilman," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "Tell you what, let's warm you up. Drop and give me 20. For a moment, Marcus thought he'd misheard. His eyes searched Brady's face for any sign of humor, some indication that this was a poorly timed joke. There was none. "I'm sorry," Marcus asked, his voice steady but tinged with disbelief. "You heard me," Brady said, his smirk widening. "Push-ups. 20. Right here. Right now." The absurdity of the demand was matched only by its cruelty. The icy pavement glittered with fresh frost, and the snow showed no sign of relenting. Marcus's mind raced. Refusing could escalate the situation. Complying would mean swallowing the humiliation that burned brighter than the freezing cold. Thompson whistled from the car. "Hey, Brady, looks like he's hesitating. Think he's too good for it?" The younger officer's laughter cut through the night, harsh and grating. Marcus clenched his jaw, his breaths steadying. Slowly, deliberately, he dropped to the pavement. The cold bit into his palms, sharp and unforgiving, as he braced himself. His tailored jacket pulled tightly against his shoulders as he began the push-ups, each movement deliberate, his muscles protesting against the strain. The world seemed to shrink to the rhythm of his movements and the echo of Brady's laughter. But Marcus wasn't doing this for them. With every push, he thought of Sarah waiting at home, of the citizens he represented, of the countless stories he'd heard in council chambers from people who'd endured similar abuses, dismissed and silenced. When he finished, his breath came in ragged gasps. His shoulders burned, and his knees trembled as he rose to his feet. Brady clapped slowly, mockingly. "Good form, Councilman. Now get back in your car before we find another reason to keep you out here." Marcus didn't respond. He climbed back into his car, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. But the tremors weren't from the cold, they were from a deep, burning resolve. As he pulled away, the red and blue lights disappearing into the snowy darkness behind him, one thought echoed louder than all others. This isn't over. The snow continued to fall, heavy and relentless, as Marcus drove toward home. But within him, something had shifted. The seeds of justice had been planted, and the storm had only just begun. A vow in the cold. The drive home that night was silent, except for the rhythmic swish of the windshield wipers clearing away the relentless snowfall. Marcus's knuckles were white on the steering wheel, gripping it as if it were the only thing keeping him anchored. The events of the past 30 minutes replayed in his mind in excruciating detail. Brady's mocking tone, the biting cold of the pavement, the humiliation of dropping to his knees in the snow. Each memory felt like a wound, raw and festering. But amid the anger and shame was something else, something sharper, stronger, a resolve he hadn't felt in years. When Marcus finally pulled into the driveway of his modest suburban home, the house was dark except for the faint glow of the porch light. Sarah, his wife of 10 years, had left it on for him, as she always did when he worked late. The sight of it offered a momentary balm to his frayed nerves. He sat in the car for a moment longer, staring at the light, letting the storm outside match the one raging within him. Finally, he stepped out, the cold biting into his already aching muscles. Snow crunched under his feet as he made his way to the door, his breath puffing invisible clouds. Inside, the warmth of the house enveloped him, and the faint smell of rosemary and garlic lingered in the air, his untouched dinner from hours earlier. Sarah was waiting for him in the living room, wrapped in a thick blanket, her dark curls spilling over her shoulder. She looked up from her book as he entered, her eyes immediately narrowing in concern. "You're late," she said softly, setting the book aside. Her voice was gentle, but there was an edge of worry beneath it. "And you didn't call." Marcus hesitated, his hand lingering on the doorknob as if he might turn and walk back out into the storm. But he couldn't hide this, not from her. He hung up his coat, his movements slow and deliberate, then walked into the living room. He stood for a moment, unsure of how to start, until Sarah's expression shifted from concern to alarm. "Marcus," she said, rising from the couch. "What happened?" He sat down heavily, the cushions sinking beneath his weight. "I had an encounter with the police," he began, his voice low. He didn't look at her as he spoke, the words tumbling out like stones. He told her everything. The bogus taillight excuse, the demand to step out into the snow, the push-ups on the icy pavement. By the time he finished, his hands were trembling again, though not from the cold. Sarah was silent for a long moment, her face a mask of barely contained fury. Then she stood abruptly, pacing the room, her blanket forgotten on the floor. "That's outrageous," she snapped, her voice rising with each word. "They knew who you were, didn't they?" "Of course they did. And they still." She cut herself off, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Marcus, this is unacceptable. You're a councilman. For God's sake, if they're willing to do this to you, imagine what they're doing to people without your platform." "That's exactly what I've been thinking," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't just about me. It's about the system that allows this kind of abuse to happen." Sarah stopped pacing, turning to face him. "So, what are you going to do about it?" Her question hung in the air, heavy with expectation. Marcus had always been a man of action, a leader who fought for the underrepresented, the overlooked. But this was different. This was personal. For a moment, he felt the weight of the decision before him. The risk, the backlash, the battles he would have to fight. "I'm going to make sure this doesn't happen again," he said finally, his voice steady. "To anyone." The first steps. The next morning, Marcus woke before dawn, the weight of his vow pressing on him like the storm clouds that still hung low over the city. He couldn't afford to waste time. The fight ahead would be long and grueling, and he needed to be prepared. He sat at his desk in his home office, a steaming cup of coffee beside him, and began writing a detailed account of the incident. Every word felt like a catharsis, a release of the frustration and humiliation he had endured. He described the officers' behavior, the cold cruelty of their demands, and the glaring violation of department policy when they turned off their body cameras. When he finished, he saved the document and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. This wasn't enough. He needed more. Marcus picked up his phone and dialed the number of an old friend, Lee Ortiz, a journalist who had built her career exposing corruption in the city. She answered on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert despite the early hour. "Marcus," she said, "what's going on?" "I need your help," he said, skipping the pleasantries. "Something happened last night, and I can't let it go." He explained everything, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. Leah listened without interrupting, her pen scratching against paper as she took notes. "This is big," she said when he finished. "But it's not enough to just tell your story. We need evidence, witnesses, something concrete." "I thought the same," Marcus admitted. "There were people watching from their windows, some of them recording. Can you help track them down?" "Leave it to me," Leah said, her voice brimming with determination. "I'll find them." The councilman's gambit. By the time Marcus arrived at City Hall later that day, word of the incident had already begun to spread. He had called an emergency meeting with the city council, a move that was certain to raise eyebrows, but he knew the urgency of the situation demanded it. The council chamber was abuzz with speculation as members filed in, many of them groggy from the unexpected early morning summons. Marcus stood at the head of the table, his expression calm but resolute. When the room quieted, he began to speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs. "Last night, I experienced something that no citizen of this city should have to endure." He recounted the events of the previous night in painstaking detail, his words painting a vivid picture of the humiliation and abuse he had faced. The council members listened in stunned silence, their expressions ranging from shock to outrage. "This isn't just about me," Marcus continued. "This is about every citizen who has been harassed, intimidated, or worse by individuals who swore to protect them. It's about a systemic failure that has allowed this behavior to go unchecked." Councilwoman Linda Graves, a staunch ally of the police union, raised her hand. "Councilman Chen, while I sympathize with your experience, I must point out that our officers are under immense pressure. They make split-second decisions in high-stress situations." "This wasn't a split-second decision," Marcus interrupted, his voice firm. "This was a deliberate abuse of power, and it's not an isolated incident. The complaints against officers like Brady and Thompson have been piling up for years, but they've been ignored. That ends now." The room erupted into debate, voices clashing as council members argued over the implications of Marcus's claims. Some supported his call for action, while others accused him of undermining the department's morale. Through it all, Marcus held his ground. He knew the fight was just beginning, but he also knew he couldn't back down. As the meeting adjourned, Marcus stepped out into the cold, his breath visible in the icy air. He pulled his coat tighter around him, his mind racing with the challenges ahead. The path forward would be treacherous, but he was ready. The snow was still falling, but Marcus Chen was just getting started. The gathering storm. The snowstorm had cleared overnight, leaving a heavy blanket of white across Baltimore's streets and rooftops. The city felt quieter than usual, as if holding its breath. But for Marcus Chen, the silence only amplified the noise in his mind. Every step forward in his fight against police misconduct felt like pushing against an invisible, immovable force. It was just past 6 a.m. when Marcus entered his study. The room was his sanctuary, lined with bookshelves and adorned with photos of his life. His wedding to Sarah, his graduation from law school, and a framed picture of his father in uniform, a proud young officer standing beside his squad car. That photo had once inspired Marcus to trust in the integrity of law enforcement. Now, it was a stark reminder of how far the system had fallen. On his desk, his laptop blinked with unread messages. Marcus sighed and opened the first email, which was from Leah Ortiz. Her subject line read, "You'll want to see this." The email included a link to a video. Marcus clicked it, and a shaky but unmistakable scene unfolded before him. The footage had been taken from a high-rise window overlooking the street where his confrontation with Brady and Thompson had occurred. Though grainy, it clearly captured him on the snowy pavement, performing push-ups while the officers loomed over him, laughing. Leah's message followed the link. "I tracked down the person who filmed this. They're willing to go on record if needed. Let's talk." Marcus's jaw tightened as he replayed the video, the humiliation washing over him again. But this time, it didn't paralyze him. It galvanized him. There it was. Proof. Not just his word, but visible evidence of abuse. He dialed Leah immediately. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp and alert. "Morning, Marcus," she said. "I take it you saw the video." "I did," Marcus replied. "This is a game changer." "It is," Leah agreed. "But we need to tread carefully. Once this goes public, it'll draw attention, not just to you, but to anyone willing to support your claims. The police union isn't going to take this lying down." Marcus paused, staring at the frozen frame on his laptop. He knew Leah was right. The video would be a double-edged sword, a powerful tool for accountability, but also a lightning rod for backlash. "I'm ready for whatever comes," he said finally. Let's use it. Whispers in the ranks. Later that morning, Marcus received an unexpected call from a blocked number. The voice on the other end was hushed, almost nervous. "Councilman Chen," the woman asked. "This is Marcus," he replied cautiously. "Who's calling?" "My name isn't important," she said quickly. "I'm an officer with the department, and I've been following your story. I saw the video. What they did to you, it wasn't right. It's not just them, either. There's more going on than you realize." Marcus's pulse quickened. "I appreciate you reaching out. Can you tell me more?" There was a pause on the line, and Marcus could hear the woman's shaky breath. "I've been on the force for 6 years," she said finally, "and I've seen things that would make your blood boil. Officers like Brady get away with whatever they want because the system protects them. Complaints are buried. Body camera footage goes missing. And if someone speaks out, they're ostracized, or worse." Marcus's grip tightened on the phone. "Why are you telling me this now?" "Because you're the first person I've seen who might actually do something about it," she replied. "But you need more than just stories. You need proof. Can you give me that proof?" Marcus asked, his voice low. The woman hesitated again, then said, "I have documents, memos, internal reports, even some emails. They show how complaints are handled or ignored. If you're serious about taking this fight all the way, I'll share them. But you need to protect me." "You have my word," Marcus said firmly. "No one will know it came from you." The woman exhaled sharply, as if she'd been holding her breath. "I'll leave the documents in a secure location. I'll text you the details later. Be careful, Councilman. You're making a lot of enemies." The line went dead, leaving Marcus with a mixture of hope and apprehension. The evidence emerges. By the time Marcus retrieved the documents later that evening, the city was bathed in a pale winter sunset. The papers were left in a manila envelope tucked behind a dumpster in an alley near City Hall. The anonymous officer had been careful, and Marcus felt a pang of gratitude for her bravery. Back in his study, he spread the documents across his desk. What he saw sent a chill down his spine. There were internal emails showing how Brady and Thompson's complaints had been flagged for an administrative review, a euphemism for burying cases until the complainants gave up. One email even referenced keeping the councilman in his place, sent shortly after Marcus's public push for police reform 6 months earlier. Another memo outlined unofficial guidelines for turning off body cameras under the guise of technical issues. It was a playbook for evading accountability. Leah joined him later that night, her notebook and recorder in hand. As she flipped through the documents, her expression grew darker. "This is explosive," she said finally. "If we release this alongside the video, it'll be impossible for the department to deny systemic issues." Marcus nodded. "But we need to do more than expose them. We need to propose solutions, real ones." Leah leaned back in her chair, studying him. "You realize this is going to get ugly, right? The union will come for you. Your colleagues on the council might back away. And you'll be a target. For them. And anyone who supports them." "I know," Marcus said, "but this isn't about me. It's about everyone who's been on the receiving end of this abuse. If I don't fight for them, who will?" Leah's lips curved into a small smile. "Then let's fight." A storm of opposition. The next morning, Leah published an expose that combined Marcus's testimony, the anonymous officer's documents, and the grainy video. The article, titled "Baltimore's Broken Blue Line: A Councilman's Fight for Justice," was accompanied by the video and excerpts from the damning memos. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Within hours, social media lit up with hashtags like #JusticeForMarcus and #AccountabilityNow. News outlets picked up the story, replaying the video and dissecting the documents. Activists called for protests, while community leaders voiced their support for Marcus's push for reform. But the backlash was just as fierce. The police union held a press conference within hours, denouncing Marcus as a grandstanding politician and accusing him of undermining the morale of the department. "We will not allow one incident to tarnish the reputation of our brave officers," said Frank Delaney, the union president. "Councilman Chen is waging a political vendetta, and we will not stand for it." That evening, Marcus returned home to find a death threat slipped under his door. The note, written in blocky, uneven letters, read, "Back off, or you won't live to see the reforms you want." He folded the note carefully and placed it in a drawer. He refused to let fear dictate his actions. The tipping point. Despite the threats, Marcus pressed forward. He scheduled a town hall meeting to present his reform proposal to the public, knowing it would be a make-or-break moment. The meeting was held in a packed community center, the air buzzing with tension. Residents, activists, journalists, and even off-duty officers filled the room. Marcus stood at the front, his notes in hand, but as he scanned the crowd, he set them aside. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he began, his voice steady. "It's about what happens every day in our city. It's about the people who've been silenced, ignored, or dismissed. And it's about making sure that no one, no matter who they are, has to go through that again." The room fell silent as he spoke, his words carrying the weight of his conviction. One by one, residents stood to share their own stories of harassment, intimidation, and injustice. Their voices were raw, unfiltered, and undeniable. By the end of the meeting, Marcus felt a shift. The people weren't just listening. They were rallying behind him. As he left the community center that night, the snow began to fall again, light and quiet. But this time, Marcus didn't feel its weight. He felt its promise. The storm wasn't over, but the tide was turning. The fight heats up. Baltimore was awakening to the fallout. The streets buzzed with conversations about Marcus Chen's bold stand against police misconduct, the damning video, and the leaked documents exposing the department's deeply entrenched culture of abuse. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a movement, one that Marcus had unwillingly become the face of. The next morning, Marcus sat in his kitchen, staring at his untouched breakfast. Sarah had made eggs and toast, her way of silently offering support as the world closed in around them. She sat across from him, sipping coffee and watching him with concern. "You need to eat," she said softly, breaking the silence. "You're running on fumes." "I can't," Marcus admitted, rubbing his temples. "There's too much to do. The council vote is days away, and the union's coming at me from every angle. Every time I turn around, there's another roadblock." Sarah reached out, placing her hand over his. "Then don't do it alone. You've got allies. Use them. Leah's working nonstop. The community's behind you, and you're not going to let them scare you into silence. That's not who you are." Marcus looked at her, his resolve hardening. Sarah was right. He couldn't let fear or exhaustion win. He had a city depending on him. The union strikes back. The police union wasted no time in mobilizing. Within hours of Leah's expose, they launched a full-scale counteroffensive. Billboards appeared across the city with slogans like, "Support our officers," "Stop political attacks," and television ads portrayed police as heroes being unfairly maligned by politicians. On social media, hashtags like #SupportTheBlue and #ChenExposed trended, fueled by union supporters and conservative commentators accusing Marcus of waging war on law enforcement. Union President Frank Delaney held a press conference that afternoon, flanked by dozens of uniformed officers. His tone was sharp, his words rehearsed. "Councilman Chen's accusations are not just an attack on two officers. They're an attack on every hardworking officer in this city," Delaney declared. "Our men and women in blue put their lives on the line every day to protect Baltimore. This so-called reform proposal is nothing more than a political stunt that endangers public safety." The room erupted into applause from the officers present, but outside, the narrative was beginning to shift. Community leaders pushed back against Delaney's rhetoric, holding their own press conferences and rallies to support Marcus and the reform proposal. One of the most vocal supporters was Ruth, the elderly grandmother who had spoken at Marcus's town hall meeting. Her fiery speech to reporters went viral. "Let me tell you something about public safety," Ruth said, standing on the steps of City Hall. "Safety doesn't mean being afraid every time you see a cop car. It doesn't mean being humiliated or ignored when you call for help. Councilman Chen isn't attacking anyone. He's fighting for justice, and it's about time someone did." Behind closed doors, inside City Hall, the atmosphere was tense. Marcus met with Councilwoman Alina Rivera and a small group of reform-minded council members to finalize the language of the accountability proposal. The stakes were higher than ever. "We've got the votes," Rivera said, her voice firm. "But barely. Some of the moderates are starting to waver because of the union's pressure." Marcus leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly. "Then we need to remind them why this matters. The video, the documents, they prove that this isn't just about bad apples. It's the system that's rotten." Rivera nodded, but her expression was cautious. "You're right, but the union's narrative is powerful. They've got people believing this is about defunding the police, even though it's not. We need to control the message." Leah joined them moments later, her phone buzzing with updates. She looked tired but determined. "I've got more witnesses," she announced, dropping into a chair. "Two former officers are willing to speak on record about the department's culture of intimidation and corruption. One of them worked under Brady and says he saw him tamper with body camera footage more than once." "That's huge," Marcus said, "if we can get their testimonies before the vote." "It'll help," Leah interrupted, "but the union's going to double down. They're already running scare tactics. There's talk of a walkout if the proposal passes." Marcus frowned. A police walkout would send shockwaves through the city, and the union knew it. It was a calculated move, designed to scare the public and sway undecided council members. A risky rally. In response, Marcus and his allies organized another rally, this time on the steps of City Hall. The goal was clear: to galvanize public support and pressure the council to stand firm. Hundreds of people braved the freezing weather to attend, holding signs that read "Accountability Now" and "Justice for All." The energy was palpable, the crowd chanting Marcus's name as he stepped up to the podium. "Thank you for being here," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "This fight isn't just mine. It's ours. It's about every mother who's lost a son, every young man who's been stopped and frisked without cause, every family who's been failed by the system that's supposed to protect them." The crowd erupted in cheers, their voices echoing against the cold stone of City Hall. "This proposal isn't about punishing good officers," Marcus continued. "It's about ensuring that the badge is a symbol of trust, not fear. It's about rebuilding a system that serves everyone, not just a privileged few. Together, we can make this city safer, for all of us." The rally was a resounding success, with community leaders and activists taking turns at the microphone to share their stories and support for the reforms. But as the crowd dispersed, Marcus's phone buzzed with another anonymous message. "You think you've won. You don't know what's coming." Marcus stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. The threats were becoming more frequent and more ominous, but he refused to let them deter him. The whisper of fear. That night, Marcus and Sarah sat in their living room, the fire crackling softly in the hearth. The warmth of the flames contrasted sharply with the chill that had settled over Marcus's thoughts. "You're scared," Sarah said quietly, breaking the silence. "I can see it." Marcus nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I am. Not for me. For you. For us. These threats, they're getting worse. I don't know what they'll do if the proposal passes." Sarah reached out, taking his hand in hers. "You've always said that doing the right thing isn't easy. This is one of those times. But you're not alone, Marcus. We'll get through this." Her words were a lifeline, grounding him in the midst of the storm. He squeezed her hand, drawing strength from her unwavering support. "I just hope this fight is worth it. he said softly. It is, Sarah replied. Because if you don't fight, who will? The day of reckoning. The day of the council vote dawned cold and overcast, the gray sky heavy with the promise of more snow. Marcus arrived at City Hall early, carrying a thick binder of documents and a heart full of determination. The chamber was packed, with every seat filled and protesters gathered outside, their voices carrying into the building. As the session began, Marcus and Rivera presented their case, laying out the evidence of misconduct and the necessity of reform. They spoke not just of the need for accountability, but of the potential for a better future, a city where trust between law enforcement and the community could be rebuilt. The opposition was fierce. Councilwoman Linda Graves stood to argue against the proposal, her voice ringing with indignation. This proposal is an overreach, she declared. It paints all officers with the same brush and undermines the very people who keep our city safe. Marcus rose to respond, his voice calm but firm. This isn't about painting anyone with a broad brush, he said. It's about holding those who break the law accountable. It's about ensuring that no one, officer or citizen, is above the law. If we want a city where everyone feels safe, we need a police department that operates with integrity and transparency. The debate raged for hours, each side presenting its arguments with passion and conviction. But when the votes were finally tallied, the result was clear. By a narrow margin, the council passed the reform proposal. The room erupted into a mix of cheers and boos, the gallery divided in its reaction. Marcus sat back in his chair, a wave of exhaustion and relief washing over him. It was a victory, but the battle was far from over. As Marcus stepped out of City Hall into the cold night, the snow began to fall again, light and steady. He looked out at the city, its streets glistening under the soft glow of streetlights. The work ahead would be grueling, the resistance fierce. But for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope. This was only the beginning. The reckoning. The passing of the reform proposal sent shockwaves through Baltimore. For some, it was a long overdue step toward justice. For others, particularly within the police department and its staunch supporters, it felt like a betrayal. The city seemed split down the middle, its streets alive with protests, rallies, and heated debates. But for Marcus Chen, the victory felt more like a beginning than an end. The real work had just begun. It was late when Marcus finally returned home after the council vote. The snow had stopped, leaving the city under a glistening white blanket. Sarah was waiting for him in the living room, her expression a mix of relief and concern. "You did it," she said softly, wrapping him in a warm hug. It passed. Marcus nodded, the weight of the day pressing down on him like the heavy winter air. "We did, but now the fight gets harder." Sarah pulled back to look at him. "What do you mean?" "The proposal passed. Isn't that enough?" Marcus shook his head, walking to the window and gazing out at the snow-covered street. "The union isn't going to let this go. They've already started mobilizing against the reforms. I've been getting messages all day, some supportive, some not. This is going to be a war of attrition, and they're betting I'll wear down first." Sarah crossed her arms, her voice firm. "Then you don't let them win. You've come this far, Marcus. Don't stop now." Her words gave him the strength he needed. He turned to her, determination etched into his features. "I won't." The union's counterattack. The police union wasted no time. Within hours of the proposal's passing, they announced a citywide protest, calling on officers and their supporters to rally against what they labeled anti-police legislation. The next morning, hundreds of uniformed officers and civilians gathered outside City Hall, their chants echoing through the cold air. Signs reading "Support the Blue" and "Keep politics out of policing" were hoisted high, and Frank Delaney, the union president, took center stage at the protest. "These reforms are an insult to every officer who risks their life to protect this city," Delaney declared to the crowd. "Councilman Chen's so-called accountability measures undermine our ability to do our jobs and paint all officers as corrupt. We will not stand for it." The crowd roared in agreement, their cheers filling the streets. Inside City Hall, Marcus and Councilwoman Rivera watched the protest from a conference room window. The energy outside was palpable, the crowd swelling with every passing hour. "They're pulling out all the stops," Rivera said, her tone grim. "This isn't just about blocking the reforms, it's about discrediting you." "I know," Marcus replied, his gaze steady. "But we knew this was coming. We have to stay focused." Rivera turned to face him. "We need to shift the narrative, Marcus. The union's playing the victim card, but we have the facts on our side. The documents, the video, the testimonies, they're all proof that these reforms are necessary. We just have to make sure the public sees that." The whistleblower speaks. As the union protests continued to dominate the news, Marcus received an unexpected call from Officer Elena Marquez, the whistleblower who had provided him with the damning internal documents. Her voice was calm but resolute. "Councilman Chen," she said, "I'm ready to go public." Marcus sat up straighter in his chair, the significance of her words sinking in. "Are you sure? Once you speak out, there's no going back. The union will come after you." "I know," she replied, "but staying silent isn't an option anymore. If I don't speak up now, nothing will change." They arranged a press conference for the following day, and the news spread quickly. By the time Marcus and Elena arrived at the community center where it was being held, the room was packed with journalists, activists, and curious residents. Elena stood at the podium, her uniform pristine, her expression steady. She took a deep breath before speaking. "My name is Officer Elena Marquez," she began, her voice clear. "I've served in the Baltimore Police Department for 6 years. I joined this force because I believed in protecting and serving my community. But what I've seen during my time here has shattered that belief. I've witnessed misconduct, abuse of power, and a system that protects bad officers instead of holding them accountable." The room was silent, every eye fixed on her. "I can no longer stay silent," Elena continued. "The documents I provided to Councilman Chen are just the tip of the iceberg. They show how complaints are buried, how policies are circumvented, and how officers like Brady and Thompson are allowed to operate without consequence. This isn't about attacking the police, it's about restoring integrity to the badge." Her words were met with a wave of applause and murmurs of support. But Marcus knew the backlash would be swift. The media firestorm. Elena's testimony became the top story on every local news outlet, and soon it reached national attention. While many praised her bravery, others accused her of betraying her fellow officers. Conservative commentators labeled her a traitor, while social media exploded with both support and vitriol. The police union doubled down on their rhetoric, releasing statements questioning Elena's credibility and painting her as a disgruntled employee with an agenda. They organized another protest, this time in front of the precinct where she worked, demanding her resignation. Elena remained steadfast, refusing to back down despite the mounting pressure. Her courage inspired others, and within days, more officers began to come forward, sharing their own experiences and supporting the need for reform. A public reckoning. The growing movement culminated in a public forum held at a local high school auditorium. The event, organized by Marcus and his allies, was an opportunity for residents to voice their concerns and discuss the path forward. The auditorium was packed, the energy in the room electric. Marcus stood at the podium, looking out at the crowd. "This isn't about choosing sides," he began. "It's about building a city where everyone, officers and citizens alike, can feel safe. The reforms we've passed are just the beginning. But real change will take all of us, working together." One by one, residents stood to share their stories. A young man spoke about being harassed by officers in his own neighborhood. A mother tearfully recounted how her son had been wrongfully arrested. An elderly man praised Marcus and Elena for their courage, calling them the voices we've been waiting for. But the most powerful moment came when a retired officer took the stage. His voice was steady but filled with emotion. I served on the force for 30 years, he said, and I've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly. There are officers out there who truly want to serve their communities, but they're overshadowed by the ones who abuse their power. These reforms aren't an attack. They're a chance to rebuild trust. And it's long overdue. The crowd erupted into applause, their cheers filling the auditorium. The turning point. As the forum ended and Marcus walked out into the cold night, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The road ahead would be difficult, but the tide was turning. The union's protests were losing momentum, and the voices calling for change were growing louder. That night, as Marcus sat in his study, he received a message from Ruth, the grandmother who had become one of his most vocal supporters. Her text read, "You've given us hope, Marcus. Don't stop now. The city needs you." Marcus smiled, the weight of the day momentarily lifting. He knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt that victory was within reach, and he wasn't fighting alone anymore. The new dawn. Baltimore was stirring with change, but change, Marcus knew, was a fragile thing. The days following Officer Elena Marquez's public testimony were both exhilarating and harrowing. Every step forward felt like a triumph, but the threats and opposition were unrelenting. His days were consumed by meetings, strategy sessions, and endless interviews. His nights were sleepless, haunted by the weight of what still needed to be done. Yet, for all the chaos, Marcus felt a glimmer of hope. The reform proposal had passed, and the city was awakening to the possibility of accountability. The voices of the silenced were growing louder, and for the first time in years, Marcus believed that Baltimore could become a city where justice was more than a hollow promise. The blowback intensifies. The police union was unrelenting in its efforts to derail the reforms. Lawsuits were filed, seeking to block the implementation of the new accountability measures. Anonymous threats flooded Marcus's office, targeting not only him, but also his allies, including Councilwoman Rivera and Officer Marquez. At one point, a package was delivered to Marcus's home, containing a shattered police badge and a crude note that read, "You broke the system. Now it'll break you." Sarah was shaken, and for the first time, she insisted that they take precautions. "Marcus, we have to talk about security," she said, her voice firm, but tinged with worry. "You can't keep brushing this off." "I can't let them see me scared," Marcus replied, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "If I show weakness, they'd win." "It's not about weakness," Sarah countered. "It's about staying alive to keep fighting. Promise me you'll take this seriously." Marcus nodded reluctantly, agreeing to hire additional security for their home and for Sarah, who had become a quiet but visible symbol of his campaign. Meanwhile, the community stood firm in their support. The protests organized by the union began to dwindle as more residents rallied around the reforms. The tide of public opinion was shifting, and Marcus felt the momentum building. Building the Oversight Board. One of the first measures of the new reform was the establishment of the Civilian Oversight Board, comprised of community leaders, legal experts, retired officers, and activists. The board was designed to provide an independent avenue for investigating complaints against the police. Its creation was a symbolic and practical victory, a tangible step toward accountability. Ruth, the fiery grandmother who had spoken so passionately at the rally, was nominated to the board, alongside retired officer Samuel Grant, a respected figure known for his integrity. Their inclusion sent a powerful message. This was a board for the people, not a rubber stamp for the department. The inaugural meeting was held in a modest conference room at City Hall. Marcus attended as an observer, sitting quietly in the back as the board began its first review of long-dormant complaints. The atmosphere was tense but purposeful. Ruth's voice rang out clearly as she demanded answers about a case involving excessive force that had been dismissed without explanation. Samuel Grant, with his deep, authoritative tone, offered a perspective that bridged the gap between the community and the department. By the end of the meeting, Marcus felt a swell of pride. The Oversight Board wasn't just a bureaucratic formality, it was working. The whistleblower's vindication. Elena Marquez, the whistleblower who had risked everything to expose the corruption within the department, became a beacon of hope and change. Her testimony had sparked a movement, and her bravery inspired other officers to come forward. One evening, Marcus received a call from Elena. Her voice was steady, but he could sense the exhaustion behind her words. "I've been reassigned to desk duty," she said. "They're calling it temporary, but we both know what this is." Marcus felt a surge of anger. "Retaliation. Probably," she admitted. "But it's fine. I knew what I was getting into. What matters is that people are finally paying attention. Officers are talking. Some are scared, but others are hopeful." Her words stayed with Marcus as he worked late into the night, drafting responses to the latest union lawsuits. The battle was far from over, but Elena's resilience reminded him why it was worth fighting. The ripple effect. News of Baltimore's reforms began to spread beyond the city. Activists and policymakers from across the country reached out to Marcus, seeking advice on implementing similar measures in their own communities. Invitations to speak at conferences and panels poured in, but Marcus turned most of them down. His focus remained on Baltimore. "I appreciate the interest," he told one organizer over the phone, "but I need to make sure these reforms actually work before I start talking about them to others." Instead, he worked tirelessly to ensure the reforms were implemented effectively. Body cameras were upgraded and made mandatory, with clear penalties for noncompliance. The Oversight Board began reviewing complaints with newfound transparency. Officers were required to attend de-escalation training, which was met with mixed reactions, but ultimately led to a decrease in use of force incidents. The changes were slow and often met with resistance, but they were undeniable. Complaints of misconduct began to drop, not because they were being ignored, but because officers were being held accountable. Trust between the police and the community, while still fragile, began to rebuild. The threat too close. One night, as Marcus returned home from a late meeting, he noticed a shadowy figure lingering near the edge of his driveway. His heart quickened, and he instinctively reached for his phone. But before he could call for help, the figure stepped into the light. It was Frank Delaney. Marcus opened his car door cautiously, keeping his distance. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. Delaney raised his hands in mock surrender. "Relax, Councilman. I'm not here to cause trouble. Just thought we should talk." Marcus stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Talk about what?" Delaney's expression hardened. "You've done a lot of damage, Chen. These reforms, do you even realize what you've done to this department? Morale is in the gutter. Good officers are leaving. Crime is up because no one wants to take risks anymore. Accountability isn't the enemy of good policing," Marcus shot back. "If officers are leaving because they can't handle being held accountable, maybe they shouldn't have been on the force to begin with." Delaney's jaw tightened. "You've made enemies, Councilman. Powerful ones. Watch your back." Without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Marcus standing in the cold, his breath visible in the icy air. A city reborn. Months passed, and winter melted into spring. The reforms were beginning to take root, and the city felt different. The Oversight Board released its first public report, detailing the complaints it had reviewed, and the outcomes of its investigations. For the first time in years, citizens felt that their voices were being heard. One bright morning, Marcus attended a community event in a park that had been neglected for years. It had been cleaned and restored by a team of volunteers, including officers and residents working side by side. Children played on freshly painted swings, and laughter filled the air. Elena Marquez was there, along with Ruth and Samuel Grant. As Marcus watched the scene unfold, he felt a profound sense of hope. "This is what we've been fighting for," Elena said, joining him. "It's not perfect, but it's a start." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the children playing. A better city, for everyone. A letter from the past. That evening, as Marcus sorted through his mail, he found an envelope with no return address. Inside was a handwritten letter from a young man. Councilman Chen, my name is Darius. My brother was killed by police 3 years ago, and no one cared. No one listened. But you listened. You stood up when no one else would, and you gave people like me hope. Thank you for fighting. Please don't stop. Marcus read the letter twice, his eyes stinging with unshed tears. He folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer, next to the photo of his father. The fight wasn't over, but Baltimore was changing. And so was Marcus. He wasn't just a councilman anymore. He was a symbol of what was possible when courage met conviction. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and for the first time in a long time, Marcus felt that the dawn of a new era had arrived.